I came to live in the Bay as a 5-year-old with my parents in 1942. My dad worked in Burrard dry docks, and at that time, our family was well aware of the World War II readiness and requirements like air raid sirens, window blackouts, and food stamps. We lived in a house that was being converted from a summer cabin into a year-round residence. We had weekly deliveries of fruits and vegetables from Johnny, and our flip-top icebox was also topped up by a delivery from Garvin Ice and Fuel that came in from Ambleside. On January 26, 1945, by the salmon float entries in the West Vancouver May Day parades, the fish and lettering in this photo were painted by Max Bambury, who lived on Douglas Street till about 1951. Max was a sign painter that did a lot of early movie advertising that was seen in Vancouver. The Willys Jeepster, with the horseshoe showing in front, was owned by Malcolm MacDonald, who ran Whytecliff Lodge at Sewell's from about 1949 to 1955. The early photographs here show how Horseshoe Bay grew from a holiday place with an emphasis of lazy days on the beach to a busy community with a major expansion of fishing, pleasure boating, and marine transportation. Cabins on the east side of the beachfront, and this is where a photograph developer lived. We took him our Kodak Baby Brownie film for images to be created. This, you can see these cabins at the bottom. Okay. Sam Heisman's boat rentals and accommodations grew. Rogers Dock in the middle of the bay, the boathouse and dance hall are seen in the center of the bay. The western part of the bay has a government wharf that was an extension of Nelson Avenue. An early Bowen ferry, the Sani, is shown near the end of the dock. You can just kind of see it in behind the other two boats. And the size of Sewell's dock is growing. I learned how to swim here, as did many others. Often there was a float with a diving board. The floats were towed around to Fisherman's Cove in the winter to escape what we called the Squamish winds. These winds blew down Howe Sound from the north. For some time, there was a buoy in the middle of the bay that was anchorage for a World War II coast patrol. It was a real challenge for anyone to swim out to it and then back to the beach. In this photo, you can see the front of Trolls. It's on an angle. It's just beside the smoking stack, chimney stack on the Horseshoe Bay Hotel. The restaurant was taken over by Joe Troll after the abandoned Victory Gardens restaurant had been closed for a time. You can also see the grocery store that's near the center of the photograph. The grocery store is just in behind the trees there. You can see a building that is a grocery store. So in 1947, the 10-year-olds Bob Chamberlain and myself found an egg in an abandoned seagull nest on Eagle Peak. Eagle Peak is now called Telegraph Hill. We had planned to take it to school to impress our class. I was caretaker of the egg and had it in my pocket when my mom sent me to the store, which was at the corner of Bay Street and Royal Avenue. Well, in the store, I put my intended purchase, bread I think it was, on the counter. But at the same time, I also bumped my side and broke the egg. Wow, the stench that was produced by that egg was unbelievable. I reached into my pocket, pulled it out with goop dripping through my fingers as I ran past the lunch counter and outside. I threw the remains down near the door and ran home to get sanitized. One of the store owners, Murray Points, was a friend of the family. I did find out later that for a short time the store was evacuated, but he never did discover who was responsible for that stink bomb. It was probably fortuitous that the egg did not survive, because it would have been a catastrophe had the breakage occurred during the long bus ride that us kids had to take from Horseshoe Bay to the only available schools in downtown West Vancouver. For your interest, this grocery store and lunch counter was on the corner where Starbucks is now. That was even before it was a gas station. This store existed well before I moved to the Bay, and there were numerous new store owners and operators in my memory. The Gardeners, Randalls, Points, and Brighton were some that I recollect. Swimming access and the layout of the docks was different each year. Here you can see like a square section that is a swimming place, and we learned how to swim there. An early job of mine was working as a dishwasher for the dining room in the Horseshoe Bay Hotel in about 1950. I was 13, and I stood on a box to reach the sink and taps easily. The winter storms that we said were Squamish winds often splashed water from the beach that froze on the face of this hotel. In the 1940s, council made an important decision. In May of 1943, there was a decision to introduce a bylaw for the purchase of about 1,000 feet of Rogers waterfront property at Horseshoe Bay, including the foreshore, the hotel, other buildings, 33 boats and wharves for $43,500. In June of 1944, the citizens authorized this purchase. 1,306 voted for, 596 voted against. The Horseshoe Bay portion of the vote was 134 and 8 against. The Blackball Ferries brought property from Sam Heisman in 1950 and started their ferry service shortly after. The bay soon became a scramble for parking spaces as passengers and crews wanted to walk on board. Here, Trolls is still angled to Royal Avenue. In the early days, Joe only opened the restaurant in the summer, and he worked as a logging camp chef in the winter months. There were also burger stands in the waterfront park, and the most westerly stand was near the head of the government dock. Lots of parked vehicles are shown here waiting for a parking strategy to be developed that would also accommodate local residents. Picnic benches in the park were very popular. This was the original burger, fish, and chip stand in the early 40s. It was near the head of the government dock. The overviews here show how the ferries really influenced the character of the bay. Blackball Ferries has taken over the eastern part of the beach and the western beach taken by the government dock plus Sewell's Marina. The Bonnabel Ferry is parked at the government dock. We like to jump off that tied-up ship for a more thrilling swimming experience. We carried luggage from passenger ferries up to the bus stop, and with the change earned, we could buy a bag of freshly steamed shrimps, freshly steamed treats from the shrimp boat that also came into the dock. The three major passenger ships and ferries were, one, the Sani to Bowen Island. We went often to Bowen Island for Sunday school picnics or for renting a horse to let us ride so we could explore more. The second ferry was the Mashigon that went to Gibson's Landing. It was a converted World War II Fairmile that was formerly used for coastal patrols. And the third was the Bonnabel that served up Howe Sound right to Squamish. It also delivered workers to the mine at Britannia and to the pulp mill at Woodfibre. Lingering in my memory bank is the sweet squeal of a bagpipe that was a treat from a Britannia Beach miner as he piped out of the bay from the rear deck of the ship as it entered Howe Sound. My first paycheck job was with Blackball Ferries, and it provided me with more cash than I could make delivering the News Herald or by washing dishes. I started in 1953 as a ramp rat working outside, and was also called on to work as a deckhand on the Steampot Ferry Smokewah. I love that ship, and especially the steam whistle that sounded arrivals and departures. Often there seemed to be a competition underway between ferry signals and the railroad. The Royal Hudson rail engine was also steam-powered and very audible across the whole bay. Many locals worked on that dock at that time, including Gary Troll. For a short time, I was a blackball ticket agent, and I also worked as a ticket agent for BC Ferries in 1962. This picture, you can see a new boathouse at the center float. My dad worked for George Dunster at the center float, cutting herring strips for bait. He also liked fishing for lingcod, and one day he gave me a 45-pound fish so I could sell it to Joe Troll. At Thorpe's location, Royal Avenue and Bruce Street, it's just into the right, you can see a couple of Pacific Stage Line buses. There were 3 drivers that lived in Horseshoe Bay. One was a family friend, Jack Orey. I picked newspapers up from here and delivered them by my wagon down to the government dock to get aboard various ferries. The new Squamish Highway and the PG Railroad construction clearing is visible. Some of the workers stayed in the Horseshoe Bay Hotel, the Cottage Inn, and at Whytecliff Lodge, which was at Sewell's. You can also see the property layouts here and notice how they conform with the grid pattern that was shown in the 1909 map. Whytecliff Lodge was at the waterfront of Nelson Avenue. Whytecliff Lodge is where our post office was. Jack Body, then Maggie Duell, were the postmaster and postmistress in my memory. Sitting in the old lodge was quite enjoyable. The lodge dining room had a stone fireplace that had a preserved king salmon carcass, one that is over 50 pounds, hung on the wall over the mantel. In the late 50s, the Thorns became proprietors, and the place became a gathering spot for having a beer and shooting the breeze. At that time, you had to have food with a beverage, but often a fake meal was placed on the table to satisfy any liquor inspectors. We called that a rubber sandwich. Walt and Marion Thorne were super hosts, and our eating habits improved when Donnie was brought in to supervise a Chinese food specialty menu. Some of my favorite memories of those times is when we sat with Jimmy Ross and he recounted stories of his life. Stories like that are lost today, so I'm trying to repeat as much as my memory allows. Jimmy's youth was spent in the Yukon during the gold rush. He became an amateur boxer, and before he'd left the Yukon, he put out a challenge to anybody for a foot race to Seattle. He came to Vancouver and worked as a teamster delivering coal for Evans, Coleman, and Evans. There was a group of teamsters that had small rat-hound dogs, and they'd gamble on who was the most successful hunter in the early days. On occasion, he was asked to transport gambling high rollers about the city. One such trip took a group to Point Grey, where they boarded a launch that went across to Larson's farm at Gleneagles to gamble on the cockfighting that had been organized. Jimmy got married and eventually settled in Horseshoe Bay. He worked in various clubs downtown and retired as the director of the Irish Canadian Veterans Association. He was a popular figure in Horseshoe Bay who worked part-time as a fishing guide for Sewell's. When there was a fundraising being done to build a community hall, Jimmy would bring out the crown and anchor wheels that he had access to. This was a great revenue generator. He was also active in the Horseshoe Bay Volunteer Fire Department, especially in the rummy games they had in the back room. I had a fondness for Jimmy and his wife, Lily, because they impressed this 5-year-old when we moved to Horseshoe Bay in 1942, and they were our first landlords. The lodge had a fire, and it was rebuilt on the same location. Sewell's occupied the whole western part of the bay. Dan, Art, and Tom all had separate homes there, as well as the new lodge, boathouse, and dock. Frank Wright and Mercury Water Taxi were in the basement of the new building on the lodge site. You can just see Mercury Water Taxi sign there. The waterfront was changing fast. Soon, the old Briggs & Stratton inboard motors would be replaced by outboards. The gas barge would become more modern. In 1951, I had just returned home from watching the movie The Thing at the Hollyburn Theater in West Van, and had not been in bed long when I was awakened by a huge explosion that rattled everything. The gas barge at Sewell's had blown up when a metal dip rod was used to measure fullness. The lookout was a new structure recent in the center of the bay. Libby Lodge, the boathouse, and Billy Lord's float house are all fairly recent appearances in the front of the bay. Walking back along Bruce Street, Jewel's Shoe Repair that became Rita's gift shop and then a tea room. Rita was great to us kids. She let us build up enough coinage so that we could eventually afford to buy a gift for our mothers. Rita lived with her parents on Douglas Street, and I delivered the Morning News Herald to them. Mr. Little wanted the paper slid through an open window, and I'd ride by on my bike and shove it in. One day I lost control and pushed the paper in my arm through the glass. It made an alarming noise, and I had a major gash to my wrist. Rita awakened, covered the gash with Kleenex, and took me to the hospital, where I got about 20 stitches and a cast to limit movement. My activities and schoolwork suffered for a while, but I still have the scar as a reminder. Benny's Inn, then Yaya's Oyster Bar, is now the Olive and Anchor, and this is another example of how things have changed over the years. Troll's Coffee Shop and Restaurant have been a long time in Horseshoe Bay, and this picture shows the rebuilt modern building that is now square to the streets. The JC's shop, which adjoins Troll's, where my mom, Betty, worked for years, as did a few other locals. The chalet became the Cottage Inn. Note the activities list that accents water activities of fishing, bathing, and boating. At this time, the streets had open ditches, and I remember tumbling into one once while trying to catch frogs for my amusement. The Texaco station had moved to a lot on Bay Street and Royal Avenue that was formerly the site of the grocery store and lunch counter that was seen in an earlier photograph. It had been relocated from the corner of Bruce Street and Keith Road because of ferry terminal requirements. The original site for the gas station was at the corner of Bruce Street and Royal Avenue. And it appears that gas stations don't want to move anymore, so Horseshoe Bay is now without a gas station. The lot was cleared and Galleries on the Bay was built. This was supposedly the new look for Horseshoe Bay and West Vancouver, and it opened with a fanfare from the WRA, Dave Patrick, and the mayor, Pamela Goldsmith-Jones, and Councillor Soprovich. Its building permit required some amenity contributions. The developers were asked to contribute to the overhead wire and cables being buried, as well as providing pedestrian access to the lower section that also contained a local notice board. The community hall on Bruce Street is shown here, and population changes and television access seem to reduce participation in community functions. The hall had seen better days, so the property was sold. Some funds went to playground improvements in the beach park and also for the payment of taxes. I remember efforts to raise the original funds and my dad, Slim, doing the electrical work when it was built. It was just after World War II, and light fixtures were hard to get, So he made the recessed ceiling lights using wash basins as reflectors. The hall was busy in early days with Sunday school, community meetings, scouts, girl guides, dances, badminton, and theater productions. For a while, there was a group that performed bi-weekly under the direction of Eric Whitehead, the sports columnist of the province newspaper. And I also remember an actor that was named Juan Root. This is another fish float entry that was assembled on a property on the corner of Bruce Street and Royal Avenue. It's ready to be driven to the May Day parade in Ambleside. The fellow standing in the boat is Pop Anthony, who lived on Douglas Street till about 1949. People may remember these cabins on Bruce Street and Horseshoe Bay, and the house in the background is still there on Nelson Avenue. I urge you to look up some of the archival information, literature, and photographs that are available. The West Vancouver archives can guide you toward opportunities for accessing historical information. I'd like to thank the Western Residents Association for this opportunity to delve into the past and hopefully enlighten a little bit for planning into the future. Thank you very much.